For 20 years, no one had ever challenged her. CEOs avoided eye contact. Politicians waited for her approval. Even her own son, a billionaire, lowered his voice when she entered a room. In the center of a private dining hall beneath a crystal chandelier, a glass trembled in a man's hand as guests froze mid-bite, and a single finger pointed across the table. Conversations collapsed into silence. This was how she maintained order. This was how she reminded powerful men who truly held control. And then a waitress spoke. What she said took less than 10 seconds, but it dismantled a dynasty that had ruled by fear for decades. Because power only works until someone refuses to bow. What exactly did the waitress know? Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The woman at the center of that silence had built her authority long before her son's fortune multiplied into the billions. After her husband's sudden death in the early 1990s, she stepped into a manufacturing empire that analysts expected to collapse within a year. Instead, under her direction, it expanded aggressively, acquiring competitors, cutting costs without hesitation, and forming political alliances that ensured favorable contracts. Former executives would later describe her leadership style in interviews with business journals as disciplined and uncompromising. Several profiles published in major American newspapers during that period documented her ability to restructure debt, negotiate hostile buyouts, and pressure city officials into supporting her expansion plans. She cultivated an image of iron control. Employees understood that public correction was part of her management philosophy. She believed pressure revealed loyalty. Her son grew up watching boardroom confrontations instead of bedtime stories, learning that hesitation was weakness and emotion was liability. By the time he founded his own technology company 2 decades later, that lesson was etched into his identity. He scaled his startup using venture capital connections inherited from his mother's network, secured federal contracts through introductions she facilitated, and accepted interviews that framed him as a visionary. Financial publications ranked him among the fastest rising executives in the country. Yet insiders quietly acknowledged that his mother still reviewed his largest strategic decisions. At charity galas, she positioned herself slightly ahead of him in photographs. At fundraising dinners, donors greeted her first. Those who studied family-owned corporate dynasties have often observed similar patterns. Control passing on paper, while influence remains concentrated in the founder's hands. On the evening of the confrontation, the dinner had been organized to celebrate a multi-million-dollar philanthropic pledge to a regional medical center. Invitations were limited to politicians, investors, and nonprofit board members. The restaurant was among the most exclusive in the city, known for hosting closed-door negotiations between business leaders and lawmakers. Staff members were briefed carefully before high-profile events like this one. Among them was a waitress in her late 20s who had transferred from another branch weeks earlier. She had worked service jobs through college, studied public health briefly before financial strain forced her to withdraw, and taken pride in observing people closely. According to colleagues who later spoke anonymously online, she possessed a calm demeanor that unsettled guests accustomed to deference. When the matriarch criticized the wine selection and questioned the staff's competence, the waitress listened without interrupting. Witnesses later recounted that the room had already grown tense when the older woman turned her attention directly toward her and delivered a remark about standards and class that caused several guests to avert their eyes. Her son remained seated. He adjusted his cufflinks. He did not intervene. That was the moment hierarchy seemed fixed. Yet something shifted when the waitress responded. She did not raise her voice. She did not apologize. Instead, she leaned slightly closer and said words that none of the guests could fully hear, but all of them could see land with impact. The matriarch's posture changed. The finger lowered. The son's expression tightened. Within hours, speculation spread quietly among attendees. In the days that followed, fragments of information began to circulate through online forums and business circles. Old court filings from the early 2000s resurfaced, referencing a wrongful termination claim filed by a former executive assistant who had accused senior leadership of pressuring her to sign documents shielding the company from liability after safety violations were reported at a subsidiary plant. Trade publications had covered the dispute briefly before it was settled out of court with a confidentiality agreement. The assistant had left the industry shortly afterward. The Waitress, as it would later emerge through investigative reporting by independent journalists, was that assistant's daughter. Over the years, she had grown up hearing partial accounts of meetings, threats of blacklisting, and the emotional toll that followed. Public records confirmed that regulatory agencies had fined the subsidiary plant for violations around the same period. While no criminal charges were filed, the episode raised ethical questions about corporate oversight that were never fully explored in mainstream coverage. According to sources familiar with the dinner conversation, the Waitress referenced documents preserved by her mother, including correspondence suggesting senior leadership had been informed of the violations before they were publicly acknowledged. Whether those documents contained legally actionable evidence remains debated, but the psychological effect was immediate. The matriarch, who had commanded rooms for decades, was confronted with a reminder that history does not disappear simply because it is managed. Within a week, the billionaire's son announced through a press release that his foundation would commission an independent review of past compliance practices within affiliated companies. Analysts described the move as strategic risk containment. Commentators on financial news networks questioned whether generational transitions within powerful families inevitably surface unresolved conflicts. The matriarch declined interview requests. She appeared once more at a public event months later, standing slightly behind her son rather than ahead of him. Those who study leadership cultures often argue that authority sustained by intimidation is inherently fragile when confronted with documented memory. The Waitress returned to work after taking several days off, declining media offers. Her brief statement to a local reporter emphasized accountability and transparency rather than personal grievance. In the broader context of corporate America, stories like this intersect with documented cases where internal whistleblowing or external pressure prompted governance reforms. Academic research from institutions such as Harvard Business School has examined how reputational risk can alter executive behavior more rapidly than legal mandates alone. In this instance, the confrontation at a dinner table became a catalyst for scrutiny that board members could no longer ignore. For viewers watching from across the United States, especially those who have spent decades navigating workplaces shaped by hierarchy and pride, the scene resonates beyond spectacle. It raises questions about inheritance of power, the responsibility carried by successors, and the cost of silence. When a dynasty appears immovable, it is often because those within its orbit choose stability over confrontation. Yet history repeatedly shows that information preserved and delivered at the right moment can recalibrate even the most rigid structures. The chandelier still hangs in that restaurant. The contract signed that evening remained valid. But those who were present remember the precise second when dominance shifted, when a voice considered insignificant altered the direction of influence. Power, once examined under steady light, rarely looks the same again. Margaret Hale had spent decades constructing a reputation that extended far beyond balance sheets and boardrooms. In financial districts and private clubs across the city, her name carried weight that could secure loans, close factories, or open political doors with a single call. Former executives who later spoke in long-form interviews described meetings where seasoned professionals found themselves reduced to silence under her gaze. She rewarded loyalty generously and corrected disobedience publicly. That approach shaped not only her corporation but also her household. Daniel Hale grew up understanding that approval from his mother was earned through performance, precision, and control. By the time he became a billionaire through his own technology ventures, industry analysts credited his discipline and negotiation skills to early exposure to Margaret's uncompromising standards. Yet behind accolades and magazine covers, acquaintances observed a subtle pattern. Daniel rarely contradicted her in public. At charity events, he deferred to her opinions on partnerships. During press conferences, he echoed her language when discussing expansion strategies. The dynamic intrigued observers who study family-run enterprises, where generational transitions often conceal ongoing influence rather than transfer it fully. So when Emily Carter answered Margaret Hale in that dining room, witnesses sensed that something deeper than a service dispute had surfaced. Why was Margaret feared across the city even after stepping back from day-to-day operations? Why did Daniel Hale, with all his independent wealth and public authority, continue to measure his words in her presence? And what secret connected Emily Carter, a waitress working a private event, to a family whose legacy was built on controlled narratives and carefully managed crises? This was not about disrespect. It was not about class. It was about something buried 25 years earlier, during a period when Margaret Hale's company faced regulatory scrutiny that threatened to slow its rapid expansion. Public records from that era reveal investigations into workplace safety compliance at a subsidiary plant operating under the Hale corporate umbrella. Though fines were issued and settlements reached, coverage remained brief, overshadowed by broader economic headlines. Internal memos cited in later civil filings referenced warnings delivered by mid-level staff that were allegedly dismissed as exaggerated concerns. Among those staff members was a young executive assistant assigned to coordinate communications between legal counsel and plant managers. Her name did not appear in major newspapers, but her sworn statements became part of a case quietly resolved through arbitration. She alleged pressure to sign documents affirming compliance before independent inspections were completed. The dispute concluded without admission of wrongdoing, and confidentiality agreements limited further public discussion. For years, the matter faded from conversation. Meanwhile, Margaret Hale's reputation for decisive leadership solidified. Daniel Hale launched his own ventures with venture capital secured partly through relationships forged during that turbulent period. The narrative of resilience overshadowed the footnotes. Yet Emily Carter had grown up in a household where those footnotes were remembered vividly. According to interviews conducted by independent journalists after the dinner incident, her mother had preserved correspondence, settlement paperwork, and personal notes detailing meetings that left lasting emotional scars. Emily did not enter the restaurant that night seeking confrontation. She entered as an employee fulfilling a scheduled shift. But when Margaret Hale's criticism escalated from dissatisfaction to personal remark, something in the cadence of her voice reportedly echoed stories Emily had heard throughout her childhood. Observers later noted that Emily's response was measured, almost procedural, as if she were presenting evidence rather than emotion. That is what transformed the exchange from a social misstep into a destabilizing moment. Daniel Hale, seated within arm's reach of his mother, witnessed the precise instant her composure faltered. For a man accustomed to controlling market fluctuations and shareholder expectations, the shift was unmistakable. The question was no longer whether a waitress had spoken out of turn. The question was whether information long considered contained had resurfaced in a setting where reputation mattered most. Across the city, conversations began recalibrating. Business reporters revisited archived articles. Online forums analyzed past litigation. Analysts debated whether the Hale family's philanthropic initiatives were genuine reforms or strategic insulation against renewed scrutiny. The dinner confrontation became a focal point for examining how influence is constructed and how it unravels. As the story unfolded, it became clear that the silence following Emily Carter's words was not born from embarrassment alone. It was recognition. Recognition that the past, once documented, retains power regardless of status. And in that recognition lay the beginning of a shift no one at the table had anticipated. Margaret Hale was not born into generational wealth, nor did she inherit influence through social pedigree alone. When her husband died unexpectedly in the early 1990s, industry analysts predicted fragmentation of the Hale manufacturing group within months. At that time, the company faced mounting debt, union negotiations, and foreign competition that had already weakened its margins. Rather than appointing an outside executive, Margaret stepped forward as interim leader, a move that board members initially described as temporary. Temporary became permanent within a year. Financial archives from that period show aggressive restructuring decisions, plant consolidations, and strategic acquisitions that stabilized revenue and expanded market share. Business columns began referring to her as disciplined and formidable. Former executives later recounted meetings where dissenting opinions were dismantled in front of peers, establishing a culture where public correction was normalized. She dismissed senior managers without hesitation when performance targets were missed and rewarded those who aligned with her directives. Charity galas and fundraising dinners reinforced her image as a civic benefactor, but behind closed doors, she demanded loyalty that extended beyond quarterly results. Daniel Hale grew up absorbing that environment as routine. Private tutors replaced playground afternoons. Boarding schools were selected for prestige and strategic networking potential. Internships were arranged not for exploration, but for exposure to industries Margaret believed he would one day command. Friends from Daniel's early years have described a young man who excelled academically, yet measured his achievements against a standard rarely articulated but constantly implied. Margaret reviewed his college choices, vetted his romantic relationships, and scrutinized business proposals before he presented them publicly. She believed pressure cultivated resilience, and humiliation, when administered with precision, reinforced hierarchy. To her, leadership required emotional containment and unwavering dominance. That philosophy earned results, and over time it shaped a family dynamic where authority was centralized in her presence. Even after Daniel founded his technology startup and secured venture capital independent of the manufacturing empire, observers noted his consistent deference during joint appearances. In interviews, he credited his mother's discipline for his success. In private board sessions, insiders reported that he still consulted her before finalizing acquisitions. Industry magazines celebrated him as a visionary innovator while quietly acknowledging Margaret Hale's enduring shadow. Even billionaires can live in someone else's shadow, particularly when that shadow constructed the framework of their ambition. On the night of the charity dinner honoring a multi-million-dollar pledge to a regional medical center, Daniel once again occupied a seat at a table where his mother presided informally. Guests greeted him respectfully, but their posture shifted when Margaret entered. She navigated the room with measured confidence, exchanging calculated compliments and subtle reminders of past favors. For Daniel, the evening represented both public validation and private test, an opportunity to demonstrate independence while avoiding confrontation. Emily Carter entered that same room from a different trajectory. She worked double shifts to manage living expenses and student loans accumulated during her time in a nursing program she had paused due to financial strain. Colleagues described her as attentive and observant, someone who listened more than she spoke. She had transferred to this upscale establishment seeking higher tips and consistent scheduling. When she received the roster assigning her to the Hale event, she researched the guest list briefly, recognizing Daniel Hale's name from technology headlines. Margaret Hale's photograph appeared in archived business articles Emily reviewed out of curiosity. As she moved between tables that evening, refilling glasses and noting preferences, something about Margaret's voice unsettled her. It was not the tone alone but the cadence, the controlled dismissal woven into casual remarks. Emily studied Margaret's face during a pause between courses and experienced a flicker of recognition that extended beyond media familiarity. She had seen that expression before in documents and faded photographs stored in her mother's file box at home, materials preserved from a corporate dispute decades earlier. That recognition did not manifest as anger. It registered as confirmation. In that moment, three trajectories intersected: Margaret Hale's legacy of engineered authority, Daniel Hale's cultivated yet constrained success, and Emily Carter's quiet inheritance of unresolved history. The dinner had been arranged to celebrate generosity and institutional support, but beneath the polished surface lay an unaddressed chapter that never reached front-page prominence. Margaret's public record emphasized expansion and philanthropy. Yet there was one chapter of her past that never made it into the press, a chapter documented in arbitration transcripts and settlement agreements rather than glossy profiles. On the night of the charity dinner, Daniel was about to confront the enduring weight of that hidden chapter once more, and Emily Carter, standing beside the table with a steady hand, had already connected the face before her to a story she had known since childhood. By the time the main course arrived, the atmosphere inside the private dining room had shifted from celebratory to strained. Margaret Hale began with observations framed as refinements, commenting on the wine temperature with a precision that suggested personal offense rather than preference. She questioned the timing between courses, noting that efficiency reflected discipline. She requested minor adjustments to seating, implying that proximity to certain donors required strategic awareness. Each remark was delivered calmly, yet each carried the weight of expectation familiar to those who had worked under her authority. Guests exchanged brief glances but remained silent, understanding that public contradiction was rarely welcomed. Daniel Hale maintained a composed posture, nodding occasionally, offering small reassurances to nearby investors, careful not to interrupt the cadence his mother had established. The staff responded with practiced professionalism, adjusting plates and refilling glasses without visible irritation. Emily Carter approached the table with a steady hand, her expression neutral as she replaced a utensil Margaret had set aside. It was then that the focus narrowed. Margaret's attention fixed on Emily in a manner that suggested recognition without acknowledgement. She asked how long Emily had worked at the establishment, her tone implying evaluation rather than curiosity. Before Emily could answer fully, Margaret shifted from critique to commentary, stating clearly enough for surrounding guests to hear that standards mattered in rooms like this, and that people like her should remain invisible. The words settled heavily across the table. Conversations halted mid-sentence. A senator's aide lowered his gaze. A corporate attorney adjusted his napkin with deliberate slowness. Daniel remained silent, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly as he measured the cost of intervention against the expectation of composure. Emily did not step back. She did not lower her eyes. She held Margaret Hale's gaze with the same calm she had maintained throughout the evening. But Emily didn't apologize. The pause that followed stretched longer than etiquette allowed. Margaret appeared to anticipate submission, a rehearsed acknowledgement of hierarchy. Instead, Emily leaned slightly closer, close enough that only Margaret and Daniel could hear her clearly. Her voice remained low, measured, almost conversational. The guests could not distinguish the words, only the cadence. Margaret's expression shifted in increments too subtle for most observers, yet unmistakable to those who knew her. The controlled confidence that had defined her presence gave way to a tightening around the eyes. Daniel noticed immediately. For the first time that evening, his attention left the room and focused entirely on the exchange unfolding inches from him. Whatever Emily Carter whispered, it was not a retort shaped by emotion. It was not an impulsive defense of pride. It was information delivered with precision. Margaret's hand, which moments earlier had rested assertively on the edge of the table, withdrew slowly. The posture that had anchored the room seemed to recalibrate. Guests sensed the alteration without understanding its cause. Silence expanded, dense and expectant. Daniel's breathing steadied as he processed the implications of what he had just heard. He recognized references to dates, to documents, to a period in the company's history that had been legally resolved yet personally unresolved. Emily straightened, her expression unchanged, and resumed her stance beside the table as though awaiting further instruction. Margaret did not repeat her earlier remark. She did not dismiss Emily again. Instead, she regarded her with a focus that blended calculation and something less familiar to those accustomed to her authority. Fear. It did not manifest dramatically. It appeared as awareness that control had shifted from assumed dominance to negotiated consequence. Daniel felt the transition in the room even before the next course arrived. Conversations resumed cautiously, yet the earlier ease had vanished. Margaret Hale, who for decades had directed discussions in boardrooms and political offices without hesitation, now measured her words more carefully. Whatever Emily Carter had revealed in that brief exchange, it altered the equilibrium at the table. And as dessert plates were placed gently before the guests, the question lingered unspoken among them all. What could a waitress possibly know that would compel Margaret Hale to reconsider her next sentence? In the days following the charity dinner, one question circulated quietly through boardrooms, media offices, and private phone calls across the city. What did she say? The confrontation between Margaret Hale and Emily Carter had lasted seconds, yet its effect lingered far longer. Daniel Hale canceled 2 scheduled appearances that week, citing strategic reviews within his foundation. Reporters who covered corporate governance began revisiting archived material connected to the Hale family's early expansion years. The narrative shifted from a social exchange at a dinner table to a broader examination of unresolved history. As independent journalists sifted through public filings, fragments surfaced that reframed the evening entirely. Legal documents from 25 years earlier referenced a confidential settlement involving a former executive assistant within Margaret Hale's manufacturing group. Though the case concluded without admission of wrongdoing, arbitration transcripts described allegations connected to internal compliance concerns and personal vulnerability during a period of corporate restructuring. Among the sealed exhibits was mention of a pregnancy disclosed during the dispute, followed by abrupt medical leave and subsequent resignation. Hospital billing records, later obtained through authorized sources, confirmed that a child had been born during that time frame, though identifying details were redacted. Estate records from the Hale Corporate Trust showed discretionary payments issued under non-disclosure terms around the same period. Adoption files from state archives indicated that an infant connected to that timeline had been placed under temporary guardianship before documentation was amended months later. The pieces did not align neatly, yet they formed a pattern difficult to ignore. Online forums began speculating whether Emily Carter's presence at the dinner was coincidence or culmination. Was she connected biologically to the Hale family? Was the whispered statement referencing lineage rather than liability? The possibility that Emily might be an illegitimate child of influence generated intense discussion. Analysts questioned whether a cover-up had occurred decades earlier, hidden behind legal settlements and corporate transitions. Daniel Hale remained publicly composed, but insiders noted that his legal team had requested certified copies of archived records within 48 hours of the event. Margaret Hale declined comment through representatives, maintaining that the dinner incident was being exaggerated beyond its significance. Yet the speculation intensified when sources close to the investigation confirmed that DNA testing had been commissioned privately to clarify circulating claims. The testing was not initiated by Emily Carter, but by parties connected to the Hale estate seeking certainty. Media outlets prepared headlines in anticipation, framing the situation as a potential inheritance dispute layered atop corporate governance concerns. Commentators debated whether the whispered exchange referenced family secrets rather than professional misconduct. As days passed, tension built around one pending confirmation. Journalists who had traced hospital discharge summaries to sealed family court modifications suggested that biological relationships might soon be clarified. And then the DNA result came back. The DNA result ended one line of speculation, but opened a more consequential one. Emily Carter was not biologically related to Margaret Hale or Daniel Hale. There was no hidden inheritance, no secret branch of the Hale family tree concealed in adoption archives. The genetic analysis was conclusive. The red herring dissolved almost instantly. Yet what replaced it carried far greater weight. Emily Carter was the daughter of Margaret Hale's former executive assistant, the same assistant who had filed a complaint 25 years earlier during the compliance dispute that briefly threatened the Hale manufacturing expansion. Court summaries and arbitration notes, long buried in legal databases, documented her allegations in restrained legal language. That internal safety reports from a subsidiary plant had been minimized before regulatory inspections, that employees who raised concerns were reassigned or dismissed, and that documentation was altered to present a cleaner narrative to external auditors. The assistant had claimed she was instructed to coordinate communications that would discourage whistleblowers from escalating issues beyond corporate counsel. When she resisted, she was terminated. The settlement that followed required confidentiality, and public attention shifted elsewhere as the company stabilized and profits rose. Emily Carter grew up aware that her mother's career had ended abruptly after that confrontation. She had watched the financial strain that followed, the relocation to smaller housing, the medical bills from a complicated pregnancy, and the quiet frustration of a professional reputation that never fully recovered. Over the years, her mother preserved copies of correspondence, meeting notes, and draft memoranda that predated the settlement. Some of those documents referenced direct instructions from senior leadership. Some included Margaret Hale's signature. Others outlined risk assessments that were never disclosed publicly. When Emily stood beside the dinner table and listened to Margaret's remark about invisibility, she was not reacting solely to personal insult. She was recalling a chapter of corporate history that had reshaped her family's life. The whisper that altered the room was not emotional or accusatory. It was precise. "I have the files, and I've already sent copies." In the flashback of that moment, Margaret Hale's confidence recalibrated instantly. She understood the implication. The documents were no longer confined to a private archive. They were in circulation. Daniel Hale heard the sentence clearly, and the effect on him was different. His immediate concern was not reputation alone, but structural stability. If the documents were authentic and reached investigative journalists or regulatory agencies, they could trigger reviews extending beyond his mother's former company into partnerships and philanthropic ventures linked through overlapping boards. The empire he had spent years expanding rested partly on a foundation whose early years were now vulnerable to renewed examination. The silence in the dining room was not confusion. It was calculation. Margaret Hale had spent decades managing narratives, ensuring that controversies were settled quietly and reputations preserved through controlled settlements. Emily Carter's statement signaled that control had shifted. Daniel recognized, perhaps for the first time publicly, that power insulated by intimidation could be penetrated by documentation. The empire was not collapsing in spectacle. It was facing scrutiny rooted in records and memory. And for a family whose authority had long depended on certainty, the realization that evidence existed beyond their reach was transformative. In the immediate aftermath of Emily Carter's whisper, the dinner resumed in form but not in substance. Conversations continued with measured politeness, yet the center of gravity in the room had shifted. Margaret Hale, who had entered with unquestioned authority, now faced a reality she could not correct with a raised eyebrow or a pointed remark. Daniel Hale sat still for several moments, absorbing the weight of what he had heard and the implications for everything attached to the Hale name. For most of his life, public alignment with his mother had been instinctive. Disagreement was handled privately, if at all. But this moment unfolded in front of donors, civic leaders, and executives whose confidence underpinned not only his ventures, but also the charitable foundation bearing the Hale legacy. Gradually, Daniel placed his hands on the table and stood. The movement drew attention more effectively than any raised voice. He looked first at Emily Carter, not at Margaret Hale, and thanked her for her professionalism that evening. The acknowledgement was simple, deliberate, and unmistakably public. Then he addressed the room, stating that transparency mattered more than tradition and that effective immediately, he would commission an independent investigation into historical compliance practices associated with the Hale Manufacturing Group and the Family Foundation. He emphasized that accountability strengthened institutions rather than weakened them. Margaret Hale did not interrupt him. She remained seated, her composure intact, yet isolated. When Daniel finished, he did not seek her approval. He resumed his seat only after ensuring his statement had been understood. The message was clear. Authority would no longer be preserved through silence. Within days, formal announcements confirmed the investigation, led by an external firm with no prior financial ties to the Hale enterprises. Commentators described Daniel's decision as a decisive pivot toward generational autonomy. Margaret Hale declined to attend subsequent public briefings. At the next philanthropic event hosted by the foundation, she was absent entirely. Those who observed her departure from the original dinner recalled that she left alone, declining assistance, her exit quieter than her entrance had been. For decades, she ruled through fear. But fear only works when everyone plays along. That night, a waitress did not shout. She did not insult. She did not plead. She simply refused to be small. And that was enough. When power is built on intimidation, is collapse inevitable? As you reflect on Margaret Hale, Daniel Hale, and Emily Carter, Consider the broader pattern that extends beyond one family. Do you think Daniel waited too long to stand up? Would you confront someone that powerful if you possessed the evidence to challenge them? And is silence a form of complicity when reputation is protected at the expense of truth? Share your perspective, because discussions like this shape how we understand authority and responsibility in our own communities. And if you think power always falls this cleanly, wait until you hear about the governor who never faced consequences. Subscribe for more real stories that examine influence, accountability, and the moments when control changes hands.